The letter arrived on an ordinary Tuesday, the kind that usually carries nothing heavier than bills or advertisements. It was 2014, late afternoon, rain tapping softly against the kitchen window of a small apartment that smelled of old paper and coffee gone cold. David stood barefoot on the linoleum, turning the envelope over once before opening it, already irritated by the unfamiliar return address. Government offices had a way of making the air feel tighter. Inside was a single page. No greeting, no warmth, just a request for confirmation of identity, followed by a sentence that made his hands go numb. Records indicated he might have been registered under a different name as a child in a displaced persons list from the late 1940s. The note ended politely, almost apologetically, as if what it implied were merely an administrative inconvenience. David was 45 years old. He had lived his entire life believing he knew where he came from. An orphan, yes, but a simple story. Born after the war, parents lost to illness, raised in institutions, then foster homes, Catholic schools, Christmas hymns, a childhood shaped by absence but not mystery. That was the version he had learned to repeat, the version that allowed him to function. The word that unsettled him wasn't records, it was the other one, Jewish. It appeared once, carefully placed like a warning label, not explained, not emphasized, just present. David read the line again, then a third time, waiting for recognition to arrive. It didn't. The word felt foreign in his mouth, like a name meant for someone else. He sat down slowly, the chair scraping louder than necessary. Memory rearranged itself immediately, without permission. A foster mother who refused to answer certain questions, a social worker who changed the subject when David asked about his birth certificate. The way official documents always seemed incomplete, corners missing, dates softened. At the time, he had accepted it as bureaucracy. Everyone had gaps, everyone had loss. Now the gaps felt deliberate. This story is about what happens when identity waits longer than memory, about a man who survived childhood without knowing what had been erased to keep him alive, and about the quiet violence of protection that lasts decades longer than intended. David folded the letter and placed it on the table, aligning it carefully with the edge, the way he always did. Control had become a habit. He reached for the phone, then stopped. Who do you call when the ground beneath your name shifts? That night, he pulled out the one object he had carried with him since childhood, a small, cracked photograph he had never understood. No names, no date, just a face that never quite looked like his. For the first time, he wondered if the photograph hadn't been incomplete after all. What if it had been waiting? And if the truth had been hidden to save him once, what would it cost to uncover it now? David had learned early that unanswered questions were safer than wrong answers. As a child, he moved through places that smelled faintly of disinfectant and overcooked food, where voices echoed down long corridors and shoes were always lined up too neatly by the door. The adults spoke in careful tones, as if volume itself could cause damage. When he asked about his parents, answers arrived prepackaged. Illness, bad luck. After the war, many things were unclear. He accepted this because acceptance was rewarded with stability. He became good at blending in. Catholic school gave him structure, routine, saints' names memorized without curiosity. Holidays passed with borrowed rituals, candles, hymns, hands folded in practiced shapes. He watched the other children to learn when to bow his head, when to stand, when to speak. Faith, for him, was never belief, it was choreography, and he performed it well. The photograph came from a box he was given when he was 12. A social worker handed it to him with a hesitation she tried to hide. "This is all we have," she said. Inside the box were ordinary things: a worn comb, a single sock, a scrap of paper with a number written on it, and the photograph, small, creased, a woman holding a child too tightly for the pose to be casual, the child's face partially turned away, caught mid-movement, as if resisting the camera. David studied it for years. He searched for himself in that face and never quite found a match. The nose was wrong, the eyes uncertain. He decided the photograph was symbolic, something kept because it felt important, not because it was accurate. Symbols were easier than facts. The first fracture appeared in adolescence. Other boys talked about grandparents, family names, stories that stretched backward instead of stopping abruptly. David laughed along, contributed where he could. Orphans learned how to improvise. He developed an instinct for changing the subject just before curiosity sharpened. The looming shadow was never dramatic, it was administrative. Forms that asked for details he didn't have, medical histories marked unknown, a birth certificate that looked official but felt unfinished. No one said anything directly, but the pauses lingered a second too long. Files closed gently but firmly. By adulthood, David believed the story had settled. He built a life around what was solid, work that rewarded precision, relationships that stayed on the surface. He married briefly, divorced quietly. He avoided genealogy projects and family trees with the same reflexive politeness he used to avoid religion-heavy conversations. Some doors were better left untested. The letter shattered that arrangement. In the days that followed, David did not search immediately. He waited. Waiting had always been his strength. But the photograph began to change in his mind, not in shape, but in weight. He noticed details he had ignored before: the woman's grip, the way the child's sleeve seemed too large, the faint mark on the back of the photo rubbed nearly invisible. A number, not a date, not a name, a registration code. David realized then that his life had not been built on absence, it had been built on substitution, and somewhere, long before he could remember, someone had decided which truth he was allowed to grow up with. The question was no longer whether the letter was accurate, it was why the truth had been delayed for 45 years, and who exactly had been protecting him. The investigation did not begin with revelation. It began with resistance. For several days, David avoided the letter as if it might change shape when left alone. He placed it in a drawer, then moved it to a folder, then stacked books on top of it. Each action felt deliberate, rational. He told himself that identity was something you lived, not something you uncovered. He had lived 45 years already. That had to count for something. But small details began to drift out of place. At work, he caught himself rereading the same paragraph without comprehension. At home, the photograph refused to stay forgotten. He took it out again, this time studying the background instead of the faces, the wall behind them, the angle of light, the way the woman's body seemed turned not toward the camera, but away from something just outside the frame. David noticed the mark on the back more clearly now. A number, faded, pressed in, not written. He typed it into an online archive late one night, expecting nothing. The site lagged, then refreshed. One result appeared: sparse, clinical. A child registered under a provisional name, listed as found, with a birth year approximating his own. The entry ended abruptly, as if the story had been cut short rather than concluded. The location froze him. It was not the city listed on his birth certificate. It was a displaced persons camp, active in the immediate aftermath of the war. David stared at the screen until the room seemed to tilt slightly. He closed the browser without saving the page. For 2 days, he carried the knowledge without touching it. He went through routines, he answered emails, he smiled at neighbors. The world continued to reward his performance of normalcy. At night, sleep fractured. He dreamed of lists he could not read, of names spoken too quickly to catch, of doors that closed softly but permanently. On the third day, he called the number at the bottom of the letter. The woman who answered spoke with professional calm. She explained that many records had been revised in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Children were renamed, birthplaces adjusted, religious identities reassigned. These were not errors, she said. They were decisions made under pressure. Pressure from whom? David asked. She paused. From reality, she replied, and fear. The email that followed contained scanned documents, thin pages, uneven handwriting, a temporary surname, a notation changed months later in darker ink. One word crossed out, another written above it, Jewish. The correction was dated, initialed. Someone had made sure the change was official. David printed the files and laid them beside the photograph. For the first time, the pieces aligned without forcing. The incomplete records, the foster placements that never finalized, the insistence on religious schooling, the quiet avoidance whenever he asked too directly. Protection, he realized, had been structured into his life so thoroughly that he had mistaken it for absence. He felt no anger yet, only displacement. That evening, he stood in front of the bathroom mirror longer than usual, searching his face for confirmation. Features he had once dismissed as coincidence now felt interrogative. He wondered how much of himself had been shaped by something he had never been allowed to name. The truth was no longer abstract. It had fingerprints. And once fingerprints exist, the question is no longer whether the past is real, but whether you are ready to let it claim you.
Knowing did not arrive as clarity. It arrived as tension. David began to feel it in ordinary moments, the hesitation before filling out a form, the way he paused when asked about his background, the subtle discomfort of choosing words that once felt automatic. Nothing external had changed. His name was the same, his address, his work. But internally, something had shifted its position, like furniture moved in the dark. He met with people whose profession was memory. Archivists spoke carefully, as if language itself could bruise. Social workers used terms that implied order, relocation, adjustment, placement, words designed to make urgency sound reasonable. David learned that in the years after the war, decisions were made quickly, often without the luxury of explanation. Children were categorized, labeled, moved. Identities were simplified to reduce risk. It wasn't cruelty, it was triage. The micro-twist came when he finally spoke with the woman listed as a witness. Her voice was steady, practiced, shaped by decades of repeating difficult truths. She did not begin with sympathy, she began with precision. She asked for the number on the photograph. She asked for the approximate year. Then she asked one question that caught him off guard. Was the child turning away from the camera? David said yes. That wasn't accident, she said. That was intent. She explained how some parents understood instinctively that photographs could betray too much, a full face, a name, a trace. Holding a child tightly while turning them away was a way of claiming them while also releasing them. Protection disguised as distance. David felt something settle uncomfortably in his chest. The woman described how identities were sometimes delayed on purpose, names postponed, religious markers altered or omitted, not erased forever, but hidden until the danger passed. Many believed the truth could be returned later, she said. They didn't know how long later would become. David asked about his parents. There were fragments, a first name that appeared once, a location that appeared twice, no confirmed ending. Survival records rarely closed stories, they only interrupted them. The woman did not pretend otherwise. After the call, David sat in silence, the photograph resting face down on the table. The moral dilemma emerged slowly, but it was unmistakable. If his identity had been concealed to keep him alive, then uncovering it now was not neutral. It was a reversal, a decision made decades earlier by people who believed secrecy was mercy. David wondered whether learning the truth honored that sacrifice or undermined it. He began noticing behaviors he could not trace, a reflex to scan rooms, a sensitivity to raised voices, an ease with adapting to new rules, skills learned without memory attached, not inherited traits, practiced ones, survival habits absorbed before language. The realization was unsettling. His past had not been absent, it had been active, shaping him, quietly, efficiently, without permission. That night, David returned the photograph to its envelope and placed it beside the documents. Two objects, two versions of the same life, one chosen for him, one deferred. He understood then that the question was no longer who he had been. It was whether he was prepared to live with the version of himself that had been deliberately hidden, and what it would demand if he finally allowed it to surface.
The next phase was not discovery. It was negotiation. David learned quickly that knowledge demanded response. Once you knew, you were expected to do something with it, claim it, reject it, announce it, perform it. Friends spoke carefully now, measuring reactions. Colleagues asked well-meaning questions that landed awkwardly, like furniture placed in the wrong room. He realized that identity, once named, invited an audience. He avoided announcements. Instead, he began with private rituals, reading, listening, letting unfamiliar words sit in his mouth without forcing meaning onto them. He visited a small archive room where records were kept in boxes that smelled of dust and glue. The past was not dramatic there. It was administrative. Numbers, lists, margins filled with corrections, history stripped of narrative and reduced to logistics. The micro-twist arrived in a sentence he almost missed. A note attached to one document read, "Child placed with non-Jewish guardians for protection. Identity intentionally altered. To be restored if possible." The phrase, "if possible," unsettled him more than the alteration itself. It implied uncertainty not about truth, but about survival. David realized then that his life had been built on a contingency plan. He was not meant to forget forever. He was meant to outlive danger. That understanding complicated everything. Gratitude tangled with resentment. Relief collided with grief. He felt anger toward no one in particular, which made it harder to carry. The people who had made the decisions were gone, or had acted under pressures he could only partially imagine. He began noticing how often people equated identity with choice. "You can choose who you are," they said. "Reinvent yourself." David understood now how shallow that idea was. Some identities were chosen for you long before you could speak, not to define you, but to save you. The moral dilemma sharpened. If his Jewish identity had been hidden to preserve his life, did embracing it now risk flattening the person he had become? He was not a blank slate waiting for truth. He was a man with habits, beliefs, contradictions. Was reclaiming an identity an addition or a replacement? One evening, he attended a small gathering without introducing himself. He listened more than he spoke. He noticed gestures that felt oddly familiar, the cadence of questions, the shared pauses. He felt both inside and outside, as if standing in a doorway that had been built decades earlier but never opened. No one demanded anything of him. The absence of expectation felt like permission. That night, David dreamed of the photograph again. This time, the child did not turn away.
The image remained blurred, unfinished, but the movement had stopped. He woke with a strange sense of calm, not resolution, but readiness. He understood then that the ring of his own story had been buried, not destroyed, waiting for a moment when uncovering it would no longer endanger the person holding it. The question was no longer whether he had the right to reclaim what was hidden. It was whether he could do so without losing the self that had survived in its absence.
David's life began to split into two parallel tracks. One track was public, work, errands, conversations that stayed polite. The other was private. Documents spread across his table at night. The photograph handled carefully like something fragile. The quiet ache of learning new terms that should have felt familiar. He became a man with a second language forming inside him, not spoken aloud, but shaping how he interpreted everything. He returned to the archives. Not every day. He didn't have that kind of stamina. He went in measured doses, the way you approach cold water, slowly, with respect for what shock can do. He learned the geography of files, boxes labeled by year, lists written in different ink, handwriting that shifted as administrators changed. The past was not a single story. It was a patchwork of decisions. The micro-twist arrived through a name, not his, a woman's. In one record, a note referenced guardian contact, followed by a surname that appeared again in his childhood paperwork, one he had never noticed because it had been buried under official stamps. It was the name of a foster mother he remembered only vaguely: soft hands, a strict voice, the smell of starch on laundry. The woman who never liked to answer questions about where he came from. David felt the room tighten. This wasn't just history, this was continuity. Someone in his own timeline had been part of the concealment, not distant bureaucrats, not abstract post-war chaos, someone who had looked him in the eyes and known more than she told. He tracked the surname. A local registry, an old phone directory, then a death notice from years earlier with surviving relatives listed. David stared at the page, his finger hovering over a phone number, and felt a new kind of fear, one that had nothing to do with the past itself and everything to do with how close it suddenly was. He called. A man answered, older, cautious. David introduced himself carefully, offering only what was necessary. He asked if the family had ever fostered a child in the 1980s. There was a pause, a long one. Yes, the man said. Why? David mentioned the name in the post-war documents. The line went silent again, but the silence was different now, loaded, not confused. Finally, the man exhaled as if he had been holding his breath for decades. I thought we weren't supposed to talk about it, he said. She said it was sensitive. Sensitive. The word hit like a dull instrument. David asked what she meant. The man hesitated, then admitted there had been letters, old correspondence kept in a tin box, documents that arrived from Europe after the war. His aunt had insisted they were not to be shown to David until he was older. Then she decided older never came. She believed secrecy was safer than certainty. The moral dilemma returned, sharper now. David realized that protection had not been a single act. It had been maintained, renewed, chosen again and again by people who believed they were doing the right thing. Secrecy was not just something that happened to him. It was something people actively preserved around him. The man offered to meet. David agreed before he could talk himself out of it. When he hung up, his hands were trembling, not from shock, but from proximity. He had spent months dealing with files and dates, with language and theory. Now he was approaching something human, motives, fear, love, shame. He placed the photograph on the table and stared at it until the room felt unreal. If there were letters, then someone had known the truth long before that official envelope arrived in 2014. which meant the question was no longer, "Who am I?" It was, "Why did they choose to keep me from it? And what else did they bury with that decision?" The meeting took place in a quiet house at the edge of town, the kind built to avoid attention. David arrived early. He sat in his car with the engine off, watching condensation gather on the windshield, rehearsing nothing in particular. When he finally rang the bell, the door opened slowly, as if the house itself needed time to adjust to the idea of him. The man from the phone call was there, along with a woman who introduced herself as his cousin. They spoke softly, instinctively, the way people do when they are about to handle something fragile. On the table between them sat a small tin box, dented at the corners, its lid scratched from years of opening and closing. Inside were letters. Thin paper, slanted handwriting, envelopes stamped decades earlier. Some written in a language David did not understand, others translated by hand with notes in the margins. The dates clustered tightly around the years just after the war, then stopped, silence preserved in paper form. The micro-twist was not what the letters said, it was who they were written to. One was addressed to the foster woman David remembered, the one who never answered questions. Another, written months later, asked whether the boy was safe, whether he was eating, whether he slept through the night. There was no name, only concern. The final letter was shorter. It thanked her for agreeing to keep the past closed for as long as necessary. David felt something loosen in his chest. This had not been abandonment, it had been coordination, a quiet network of adults choosing delay over disclosure, believing that time itself could soften truth. The foster woman had not been hiding information out of indifference, she had been guarding it. "She thought you'd ask someday," the cousin said carefully. "She just didn't think she'd still be alive when you did." David held one of the letters, noticing how the ink had bled slightly at the edges, as if written by someone whose hand was not steady. He imagined the person on the other end, writing without knowing if the letter would arrive or if the child it described would survive long enough to read anything at all. After the meeting, David walked for a long time. He did not feel anger. He did not feel gratitude either. What he felt was weight, shared, redistributed. The truth had not been kept from him out of malice. It had been carried by others who believed it was too heavy for a child to hold. That night, he placed the photograph, the letters, and the documents side by side. For the first time, they formed a single narrative instead of competing versions. He understood now that his life had been shaped not by erasure, but by postponement. The truth had waited for a moment when it would no longer endanger the person receiving it. The echo of the past did not demand that he change his name, his habits, or his faith overnight. It demanded something quieter, acknowledgement, and the willingness to carry forward what had been hidden, not as a replacement for who he was, but as an extension of it. The final question was no longer whether he belonged to this history. It was how he would let it live inside him without letting it consume the life he had already built.
David did not announce his discovery to the world. There was no moment of public declaration, no dramatic shift in how he introduced himself. Identity, he had learned, did not require performance to be real. Instead, he made smaller, quieter adjustments, internal ones. He allowed the truth to sit beside his life rather than replace it. He returned the letters to their box, but not to the shelf. He kept them accessible, not as relics, but as context. On difficult days, he reread a single line, questions about whether a child was warm, whether he slept through the night. He realized then that love had reached him long before memory ever could.
It had simply taken a longer route. David began to speak differently about his past, not more often, more honestly. When asked where he was from, he no longer rushed to simplify. He allowed pauses. He said, "It's complicated," and let that be sufficient. Complexity, he discovered, was not a weakness. It was evidence of survival layered over time. The final reveal arrived not through documents, but through choice. One afternoon, he attended a small remembrance gathering. Nothing formal, no expectations placed on him. He stood at the back, listening, observing, letting the weight of collective memory exist without demanding ownership. When a candle was offered, he hesitated only briefly before accepting it. The flame was small, unremarkable, but as he held it, David understood that the truth of his life was not hidden anymore. It was integrated. He was not reclaiming something stolen. He was acknowledging something preserved. Later, at home, he placed the photograph in a simple frame. Not to solve it, not to complete it, but to honor the intention behind it. A mother turning her child away, not from love, but toward survival. A decision made without certainty, carried forward by strangers, sustained by silence. David did not feel whole in the way stories often promise. He felt continuous. The boy he had been, the man he had become, and the identity delayed for decades were no longer competing narratives. They were chapters of the same life, written out of order, but bound together by necessity. In time, David would tell others his story, not as revelation, but as reassurance. That identity can wait. That protection can look like silence. That survival does not erase origin, it postpones it. And that sometimes the most profound inheritance is not a name or a tradition, but the quiet knowledge that someone once chose your life over their own need to be remembered. That choice, he realized, had been with him all along. He had simply grown into the moment when he was finally strong enough to carry it.